Welcome to the 61st broadcast of the t-roh Show. This is your host, Keith. I got John with me. Say hello, John.
Good morning, Keith.
All right.
Good morning, everybody.
What we're going to do is we're going to be talking about silent weapons for quiet wars. I'm just going to read it to you. And some of it gets kind of boring in places, but it does make sense afterwards, how all this is done and how you're being manipulated. So here it is right here. This is coming from a book called Behold a Pale Horse. It was written by William Cooper. It was very popular back in the 90s, big time popular back in the 90s. And a lot of the people today don't even, or have never even heard of this. So I'm going to read. This is the Illuminati's declaration of war upon the people of America. Silent weapons for quiet wars. And the security is patently impossible to discuss social engineering or the automation of a society. The engineering social automation systems, silent weapons, on a national and worldwide scale without implying intensive objectives of social control and the destruction of human life, slavery, genocide. This manual is in itself an analog declaration of intent. Such a writing must be secured from public scrutiny. Otherwise, it might be recognized as a technically formal declaration of domestic war. Furthermore, whenever any person or group of persons, I need you to mute out, John,
Okay.
position of great power and without full knowledge and consent of the public uses such knowledge and methodology for economic conquest, it must be understood that a state of domestic warfare exists between the said person and or group of persons and the public. So that tells you right there, folks, that this has been implemented and you are under a condition of domestic warfare. The solution of today's problems requires an approach which is ruthlessly candid, and with no agonizing over religious, moral, or cultural values. You have qualified for this project because of your ability to look at human society with cold objectivity, and yet analyze and discuss your observations and conclusions with others of similar intellectual capacity without a loss of discretion or humility. Such virtues are exercised in your own best interest. Do not deviate from them. All above emphasis are mine or those of the following two sections, and including bracketed additions throughout. I do recognize this document based upon documents' own admission as a formal declaration of war by the Illuminati upon the citizens of the United States of America. I acknowledge that the state of war exists and has existed between citizens of the United States of America and the Illuminati aggressor based upon this recognition. That was what William Cooper wrote right here. So I'm going to skip a lot of these notes. Silent weapon technology has evolved from operations research as strategic and tactical methodology developed under the military management Eisenhower in England during World War II. The original purpose of the operations research was to study the strategic and tactical problems of air and land defense with the objective of effective use of limited military resources against foreign enemies. It was soon recognized by those in positions of power, the Council on Foreign Relations, that the same methods might be useful for totally controlling a society, but better tools were necessary. Social engineering, the analysis of automation of a society, requires the correlation of great amounts of constantly changing economic information. So a high-speed computerized data processing system was necessary, which could race ahead of the society and predict when the society would arrive for capitulation. Relay computers were too slow, but the electronic computer invented in 1946 by Presper Eckert and Mauchly filled the bill. The next breakthrough was the development of the simplex method of linear programming in 1947 by a mathematician. Then in 1948, the transistor invented by Bardeen and Brattain and Shockley promised great expansion by the computer field by reducing space and power requirements. The next breakthrough was the development of the simplex method of linear programming. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm rereading that. I hate when that happens. these three inventions under their direction, those in positions of power strongly suspected that it was possible for them to control the whole world with a push of a button. Immediately, the Rockefeller Foundation got in on the ground floor by making a 4-year grant to Harvard College, funding the Harvard Economic Research Project for the study of structure of the American economy. 1 year later, in 1949, the United States Air Force joined in. In 1952, the original grant period terminated, and a high-level meeting of the elite was held to determine the next phase of social operations research. The Harvard Project had been very fruitful, as is borne out of the publication of some of its results in 1953, suggesting the feasibility of economic social engineering. Studies of the structure of American economy, copyright 1953, international sciences, blah, 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 engineered in the last half of the decade in the 1940s, a new quiet war machine stood, so to speak, in sparkling gold-plated hardware on a showroom floor by 1954. With the creation of the maser in 1954, the promise of unlocking unlimited sources of fusion atomic energy from the heavy hydrogen and seawater, and the consequent availability of unlimited social power was possibly only decades away. The combination was irresistible. The Quiet War was quietly declared by the international elite, the Bilderberg Group, at the meeting held in 1954. That's where the King of the Netherlands is part of that group there. Although the silent weapons system was nearly exposed 13 years later, the evolution of the new weapons system has never suffered any major setbacks. This volume marks the 25th anniversary of the beginning of the Quiet War. Already, this domestic war has had many victories and many fronts throughout the world. In 1954, it is well recognized by those in positions of authority that it was only a matter of time, only a few decades, before the general public would be able to grasp and upset the cradle of power, for the very elements of the new silent weapon technology were accessible for public utopia, as they were for providing a private utopia. The issue of primary concern, that of dominance, revolved around the subject of the energy sciences. This is where it gets a little boring, but it starts making sense. Energy is recognized as the key to all activity on Earth. Natural science is the study of sources and control of natural energy. The social science, theoretically expressed as economics, is the study of the sources and control of social energy. Both are bookkeeping systems. Mathematics. Therefore, mathematics is a primary energy science, and the bookkeeper can be the king of if the public can be kept ignorant of the methodology of the bookkeeping. All science is merely a means to an end. The means to knowledge is knowledge. The end is control. The end always justifies the means. Beyond this remains only one issue: who will be the beneficiary? In 1954, this was the issue of primary concern. Although the so-called moral issues were raised, in view of the law of natural selection, it was agreed that the nation or world of people who will not use their intelligence are no better than animals who do not have intelligence. Such people are beasts of burden and stakes on the table by choice and consent. Consequently, in the interest of future world order, peace, and tranquility, it was decided to privately wage a quiet war against the American public with an ultimate objective of permanently shifting the natural and social energy, wealth, of the undisciplined and irresponsible many into the hands of the self-disciplined, responsible, and a worthy few. In order to implement this objective, it was necessary to create, secure, and apply new weapons, which, as it turned out, were a class of weapons so subtle and sophisticated in their principle of operation, of public appearance, as to earn for themselves the name silent weapons. In conclusion, the objective of economic research was conducted by the magnates, capital, banking, and the industries of commodities, goods, and vices, is the establishment of an economy which is totally predictable and manipulative. In order to achieve a totally predictable economy, the low-class elements of the society must be brought under total control, must be housebroken, trained, and assigned a yoke and long-term social duties from a very early age, before they have an opportunity to question the propriety of the matter. In order to achieve such conformity, the lower family unit must be disintegrated by the process of increasing preoccupation of the parents and the establishment of the government operated daycare centers for the occupational orphaned children. The quality of education given to the lower class must be of the poorest sort, so that the moat of ignorance isolating the inferior class from the superior class is and remains incomprehensible to the inferior class. With such an initial handicap, even bright lower class individuals have little of any hope of extricating themselves from their assigned lot in life. This form of slavery is essential to maintain some measure of social order, peace, and tranquility for the ruling upper class. Some sick stuff in it. It says everything that is expected from an ordinary weapon is expected from a silent weapon by its creators, but only in its own manner of junctioning. It shoots situations instead of bullets, propelled by data processing instead of chemical reaction, explosion, originating from bits of data instead of grains of gunpowder, from a computer instead of a gun, operated by a computer programmer instead of a marksman, under the orders of banking magnate instead of military general. It makes no obvious explosive noises, causes no obvious physical or mental injuries, and does not obviously interfere with anyone's daily social life. Yet it makes an unmistakable noise, causes unmistakable physical and mental damage, and unmistakably interferes with the daily social life. Unmistakable to a trained observer one who knows what to look for. The public cannot comprehend this weapon, and therefore cannot believe that they are being attacked and subdued by a weapon. The public might instinctively feel that something is wrong. Isn't that the truth? But because of the technical nature of the silent weapon, they cannot express their feeling in a rational way or handle the problem with intelligence. Therefore, they do not know how to cry for help and do not know how to associate with others to defend themselves. When a silent weapon is applied gradually, the public adapts to its presence and learns to tolerate its encroachment on their lives until the pressure, psychological via economic, becomes too great and they crack up. Therefore, the silent weapon is a type of biological warfare. It attacks the vitality, options, and mobility of the individuals of society by knowing, understanding, manipulating, and attacking their sources of natural and social energy and their physical, mental, and emotional strengths and weaknesses. Theoretical introduction. All right. Give me a control over a nation's currency, and I care not who makes its laws. Today's silent weapons technology is an outgrowth of a simple idea discovered, succinctly expressed, and effectively applied by the quote of Rothschild. Mr. Rothschild discovered the missing passive component of the economy theory known as economic inductance. He, of course, did not think of his discovery in these 20th century terms. And to be sure, mathematical analysis had to wait for the Second Industrial Revolution, the rise of the theory of mechanics and electronics, and finally, the invention of the electronic computer before it could be effectively applied in the control of the world economy. In the study of energy systems, there always appear three elementary concepts. There are potential energy, kinetic energy, and energy dissipation. And corresponding to these concepts, there are three idealized, essentially pure physical counterparts called passive components. In the science of physical mechanics, the phenomenon of potential energy is associated with a physical property called elasticity or stiffness and can be represented by a stretched spring. In electronic science, potential energy is stored in a capacitor instead of a spring. This property is called capacitance instead of elasticity or stiffness. In the science of physical mechanics, the phenomenon of kinetic energy is associated with a physical property called inertia or mass and can be represented by a mass or a flywheel in motion. In electronic science, kinetic energy is stored in an inductor in a magnetic field instead of a mass. This property is called inductance instead of inertia. In the science of physical mechanics, the phenomenon of energy dissipation is associated with a physical property called friction or resistance and can be represented by a dash spot or other device which converts system energy into heat. In electronic science, the dissipation of energy is performed by an element called either a resistor or conductor, the term resistor being the one generally used to express the concept of friction, and the term conductor being generally used to describe a more ideal device. Employed to convey electronic energy efficiently from one location to another, the property of resistance or conductor is measured in either resistance or conductance reciprocals. In economics, these three energy concepts are associated with economic capacitance, capital, money, stock, inventory, investment on buildings and durables; economic conductance, goods, production flow of coefficients; and economic conductance and inductance, services, the influence of the population of industry and output. All of the mathematical theory developed in the study of one energy system, mechanics, electronics, can be immediately applied in the study of any other energy system. Okay, his discovery was Mr. Rothschild had discovered was the basic principle of power, influence and control over people as applied to economics. That principle is when you assume the appearance of power, people soon give it to you. That's why everybody always said, who's this guy in power? Well, it's because everybody gave it to him. That principle is when you assume the appearance of power, people soon will soon give it to you. So Mr. Rothschild had discovered that currency or deposit loan accounts had the required appearance of power, that it could be used to induce people, emphasis inductance, with people corresponding to a magnetic field, into surrendering their real wealth in exchange for a promise of greater wealth instead of real compensation. They would put up a real collateral in exchange for a loan of promissory notes. Mr. Rothschild found that he could issue more notes than he had backing for, so long as he had someone's stock of gold as a persuader to show it to his customers. Mr. Rothschild loaned his promissory notes to individuals and to governments. These would create overconfidence. Then he could make money scarce, tighten control of the system, and collect the collateral through the obligation of contracts. The cycle was then repeated. These pressures could be used to ignite a war. Then he would control the availability of currency to determine who would win the war. That government which agreed to give him control of its economic system got his support. Collection of debts was guaranteed by economic aid to the enemy of the debtor. The profit derived from this economic methodology made Mr. Rothschild all the more able to extend his wealth. He found the public greed would allow currency to be printed by a government under beyond the limits, inflation of backing and precious metal, or the production of goods and services, gross national product. In this structure, credit presented as pure element called currency has the appearance of capital, but is in fact negative capital. Hence, it has the appearance of service, but is in fact indebtedness or debt. It is therefore an economic inductance instead of an economic capacitance, and if balanced in no other way, will be balanced by the negation of population or genocide. The total goods and services represent real capital called the gross national product. The currency may be printed up as a level of and still represent economic capacitance. The currency printed beyond this level is subtractive, represents the introduction of economic inductance, and constitutes notes of indebtedness. War is therefore the balance of the system by killing the true creditors, the public, which we have taught to exchange true value for inflated currency, and falling back on whatever is left of the resources of nature and regeneration of those resources. Mr. Rothschild had discovered that currency gave him the power to rearrange the economic structure to his own advantage, to shift economic inductance into those economic positions which would encourage the greatest economic instability and oscillation. The final key to economic control had to wait until there was sufficient data and high-speed computing equipment to keep the close watch on the economic oscillations created by price shocking and excess paper energy credits, paper inductance inflation. The breakthrough was the aviation field provided the greatest evolution in economic engineering by way of mathematical theory electroshocking test. In this process, a projectile is fired from an airframe. On the ground, an impulse of the recoil is monitored by vibration transducers connected to the airframe and wired to the chart recorders. By studying the echoes or reflections of the recoil impulse the airframe, impulse in the airframe, it is possible to discover critical vibrations in the structure of the airframe, which either vibrations of the engine or aileron vibrations of the wings, or a combination of the two, might reinforce, resulting in a resonant self-destruction of the airframe in flight as an aircraft. From the standpoint of engineering, this means that the strengths and weaknesses of structure of the airframe is in terms of vibrational energy can be discovered and manipulated. Now, to use this method of airframe shock testing in economic engineering, the prices of commodities are shocked, and the public consumer reaction is monitored. The resulting echoes of the economic shock are interpreted theoretically by computers, and the psycho-economic structure of the economy is thus discovered. It is by this process that partial differential and different matrices are discovered that define the family household and make possible its evaluation as an economic industry. Dissipative consumer structure. Then the response of the household to future shocks can be predicted and manipulated. The society becomes a well-regulated animal with its reins under the control of a sophisticated computer-regulated social energy bookkeeping system. Eventually, every individual element of the structure comes under computer control through the knowledge of personal preferences. Such knowledge guaranteed by Computer Association of Consumer Preferences, Universal Product Code, UPC, zebra stripe pricing codes on packages with identified consumers, identified via association with the use of a credit card, and later a permanent tattooed body number, invisible under normal ambient illumination. Basically, it won't show up unless you get a black light on. Sick stuff so far. The Harvard Economic Research Project, 1948, was an extension of World War II operations research. Its purpose was to discover the science of controlling an economy. At first, the American economy, and then the world economy. It was felt that with sufficient mathematical foundation and data, it would be nearly as easy to predict and control the trend of an economy as to predict the control the trajectory of a projectile, such as proven to be the case. Moreover, the economy has been transformed into a guided missile on target. The immediate aim of Harvard project was to discover the economic structure. What forces change that structure, how the behavior of the structure can be predicted, and how it can be manipulated. What was needed was a well-organized knowledge of mathematical structures and interrelationships of investment, production, distribution, and consumption. To make a short story of it all, it was discovered that the economy obeyed the same laws as electricity, and that all of the mathematical theory and practical and computer know-how developed for the electronic field could be directly applied in the studies of economics. This discovery was not openly declared. It was more subtle implications were and are kept a closely guarded secret. For example, that in an economic model, human life is measured in dollars, and then the electric spark generated when opening a switch connected to an active inductor is mathematically to the initiation of a war. The greatest hurdle with theoretical economists faced was the accurate description of the household as an industry. This is a challenge because consumer purchases are a matter of choice, which in turn is influenced by income, price, and other economic factors. This hurdle was cleared in an indirect and statistically approximate way by an application of shock testing to determine the current characteristic called current technical coefficients of a household industry. Family because problems in theoretical economics can be translated very easily into problems in theoretical electronics. The solution translated back again. It follows that only a book of language, translation, and concept of definition needed to be written for economics. The remainder could be gotten from standard works on mathematics, electronics. This makes the publication of books in advanced economics unnecessary and greatly simplifies the project security. An ideal industry is defined as a device which receives value from other industries in several forms and converts it into one specific product for sales, distribution, and, to other industries. It has several inputs and one output. What the publicly normally thinks of as one industry is really an industrial complex where several industries under one roof produce one or more products. Three industrial classes are industries fall into three categories or classes by type of input: capital, goods, and services. Industries exist at three levels: nature, source of energy and raw materials; government, printing of currency equal to gross national product; GMP, an extension inflation of currency in excess of GMP; banking, loaning of money for interest and extension, inflation counterfeiting of economic value through deposit loan accounts. Class two industries exist as producers of tangible or consumer dissipated products. This sort of activity is usually recognized and labeled by the public as an industry. Industries are those which have service rather than a tangible product as their output. These industries are called households and governments. Their output is human activity of mechanical sort, and their basis is population. The whole economic system can be represented by a three industry model if one allows the names of the output to be capital, goods, and services. The problem with this representation is that it would not show the influence of, say, the textile industry on the ferrous metal industry. This is because both the textile industry and the ferrous metal industry would be contained within the single classification called the goods industry. And by this process of combining or aggregating these two industries under one system block, they would lose their economic individuality. A national economy consists of simultaneous flows of production, distribution, consumption, and investment. If all these elements, including labor and human functions, are assigned a numerical value, like a units of measure, say $1939, then this flow can be further represented by a current flow in the electronic circuit, and its behavior can be predicted and manipulated with useful precision. The three ideal passive energy components of electronics, the capacitor, the resistor, and inductor, correspond to the three ideal passive energy components of economics, called the pure industries of capital, goods, and services, respectively. Economic capacitance represents the storage of capital in one form or another. Economic conductance represents the level of conductance of materials for the production of goods. Economic conductance represents an inertia of economic value and motion. This is a population phenomenon known as services. An electrical inductor, coil of wire, has an electric current as its primary phenomenon and a magnetic field as the secondary phenomenon, inertia. Corresponding to this, an economic inductor has a flow of economic value as its primary phenomenon and the population field of its secondary phenomenon of inertia. When the flow of economic value, money, diminishes, the human population field collapses in order to keep the economic value, money, flowing. Extreme case, war. This public inertia is a result of consumer buying habits, expected standard of living, etc., and is generally a phenomenon of self-preservation. Inductive factors to consider: population, magnitude of economic activities of the government, the method of financing these government activities, see Peter-Paul principle, inflation of the currency. Okay, a few examples will be given. Charge, coulombs, dollars, okay, 1939. Flow current, amperes, dollars of flow per year. Motivating force, volts, dollars, output demand. Conductance, amperes per volt, dollars of flow per year, per dollar demand. Capacitance, dollars of production inventory. stock per dollar demand. All right. The flow of relationships and self-destructive oscillations. An ideal industry may be symbolized electronically in various ways. The simplest way to represent a demand by a voltage is a supply by a current. When this is done, the relationship between the two becomes what is called admittance, which can result from three economic factors: hindsight flow, present flow, and foresight flow. Foresight, foresight flow is a result of that property of living entities to cause energy food to be stored for a period of low energy, winter season. It consists of demands made upon an economic system for that period of low energy, winter season. A production industry, it takes several forms, one of which is known as production stock or inventory. In electronic symbology, this specific industry demand, the pure capital industry, is represented by capacitance in the stock, or the resource is represented by a store charge. Satisfaction of the industry demand suffers a lag because the loading effect of inventory priorities. Present flow ideally involves no delays. It is, so to speak, input today for output today, in hand to mouth flow. In electronic symbology, this specific industry demand is pure use industry, is represented by a conductance, which is then a simple economic valve. Hindsight flow is known as habit or inertia. In electronics, this phenomenon is a characteristic of an inductor, economic analog, a pure service industry, in which a current flow, economic analog, flow of money creates a magnetic field, economic analog, active human population, which, if the current money flows begins to diminish, collapse war to maintain a current flow of money, energy. Other large alternatives to war as economic inductors or economic flywheels are an open-ended social welfare program or an enormous but fruitful open-ended space program. The problem with stabilizing the economy, their economic system, is that there is too much demand on account of one, too much greed, and too much population. This creates excessive economic inductance, which can only be balanced with economic capacitance, true resources or value, in goods or services. The social welfare program is nothing more than an open-ended credit balance system which creates a false capital industry to give non-productive people a roof over their heads and food in their stomachs. This can be useful, however, because the recipients become state property in return for the gift, a standing army for the elite, for he who pays the piper picks a tune. Okay, those who get hooked on the economic drug must go to the elite for a fix. And this, the method of introducing large amounts of stabilizing capacitance is by borrowing on the future credit of the world. This is a fourth law of motion. Onset and consists of performing an action and leaving the system before the reflected reaction returns to the point of action, a delayed reaction. The means of surviving this reaction is by changing the system before the reaction can return. By this means, politicians become popular in their own time, and public pays for it later. In fact, the measures of such politician is a delay time. The same thing is achieved by a government by printing money beyond the limit of the gross national product, an economic process called inflation. Remember that inflation is the only act of printing money in excess of the gross national product. They could blame it on the price of the widgets or the oil only because you never knew the real cause. The real cause is the only cause of inflation is the printing of more money beyond the gross national product. This puts a large quantity of money into the hands of the public and maintains a balance against their greed, creates a false self-confidence in them, and for a while stays the wolf from the door. They must eventually resort to war to balance the account, because war ultimately is merely an act of destroying the creditor, and the politicians are the publicly hired hitmen that justify the act to keep the responsibility of the blood off the public conscience. If the people really cared about their fellow man, they would control their appetites, greed, procreation, so that they would not have to operate on a credit or welfare social system which steals from the worker and to satisfy the bum. Since most of the general public will not exercise restraint, there are only two alternatives to reduce the economic inductance of the system. Let the populace bludgeon each other to death in war, which will only result in the total destruction of the living earth, or take control of the world by use of the economic silent weapons in the form of quiet warfare, and reduce the economic inductance of the world to a safe level by a process of benevolent slavery and genocide. So basically, they're saying you can't take care of yourself. All right, the latter option has been taken as obviously better option. At this point, it should be crystal clear to the reader why absolute secrecy about the silent weapons is necessary. The general public refuses to improve its own mentality and its faith in its fellow man. It has become a herd of proliferating barbarians, and so to speak, a blight upon the face of the earth. They do not care enough about economic science to learn why they have not been able to avoid war despite religious morality, and their religious or self-gratifying refusal to deal with earthly problems renders the solution of the earthly problem unreachable by them. It is left to those few who are truly willing to think and survive as the fittest to survive, to solve the problem for themselves as the few who really care. Otherwise, exposure of the silent weapon would destroy our only hope of preserving the seed of future true humanity. The industries of finance, banking, manufacturing, and government, really real counterparts of the pure industries of capital goods and services, are easily defined because they are generally logically structured. Because of their processes can be described mathematically and their technical coefficients can be easily deduced. This, however, is not the case with the service industry known as the household industry. I remember that, John, in the 1950s when they started basically putting together the household industry with new stoves and new refrigerators and all that.
Right. That's when Jim Walter and all those cracker buck houses started being put on the market.
Yeah, I remember that. All
Yeah.
right. Okay, the problem which a theoretical economist faces is that the consumer preference of any household is not easily predicted, and the technical coefficients of any one household tend to be nonlinear, very complex and variable function of income prices. Now everybody understands why you have a computer in your refrigerator. That's to keep track of what you buy, so that they can know what to produce and all that. That's all that's going on there. It is definitely not for your convenience. Your convenience is not a concern. All right, computer information derived from the use of the Universal Product Code in conjunction with a credit card purchase as an individual household identifier could change the state of affairs, but the UPC method is not yet available on a nationwide, national, or even significant regional scale. Now, this was an older book. They've already surpassed the UPC code. To compensate for this data deficiency, an alternate indirect approach of analysis has been adopted, known as economic shock testing. This method, widely used in the aircraft manufacturing industry, develops an aggregate statistical sort of data. Applied to economics, this means that all of the households in the region or in a whole nation are studied as a group or class rather than individually, and the mass behavior rather than individual behavior is used to discover useful estimates of the technical coefficients governing the economic structure of the hypothetical single household industry. One method of evaluating the technical coefficients of the household industry depends upon shocking the prices of the commodity and noting the changes on the sales and all the commodities. That's how much. That's how they find out how much money is in your pocket. Like if you don't use a bank,
Mm-hmm.
they'll and you use cash all the time, they'll raise the prices to see if people can afford it. That way they know where the money is.
Yep.
If people still buy it, then they go, okay, well, it's not in the bank and it's not going through the credit cards. So obviously these people they have a bunch of cash. They can tell if there's a bunch of cash in an area by shocking the prices. There's also like when you go to the auto store and you go and get a part. Okay, how do they know what part you need? That's the whole thing. So what they do is they do a market research in an area like with AutoZone or something like that, and they keep track of what's ordered and what isn't, and also keep track of what type of cars are in the area. They do that through the car registration. They'll know what size tires to keep in stock. They'll know what parts they'll need and what go out. That way, you go to the AutoZone, they always have the part, and it's like, how the hell do they do it? It's like magic. you know, how do they know that this part is be useful here or is needed here? So in recent times, there's a lot of people just don't think of that. Is all I'm saying. The application of operations research to the study of public economy is been obvious for anyone who understands the principle of shock testing. And the shock testing of an aircraft airframe, the recoil impulse of firing a gun mounted on the airframe causes shock waves in that structure, which tell aviation engineers the conditions are under which parts of the airplane or a whole airplane or its wings will start to vibrate or flutter like a guitar string, a flute reed, or a tuning fork and disintegrate or fall apart in flight. Economic engineers achieve the same result in study behavior of economy and consumer public by carefully selecting a staple commodities such as beef, coffee, gasoline, or sugar, and then causing a sudden change or stock in its price or availability, thus kicking everybody's budget and buying habits out of shape. You'll see how they do that. So when the price starts going up, like in gas, 345, well, I bought it over here, it's 210. And another one they said, well, it's 345 over here. They'll generally, if they want to break a town, if you don't like the mayor in a town, this is how you can do this. All you got to do is raise the prices of the gas in that town. And what happens is people go to the next town and start buying gas there. They'll drive 10 miles to save 10 cents on the dollar or 10 cents on the gallon. So they all start going to this other town, and then the economy starts going bad in that town. The mayor is blamed, and they can change the mayor. That's how you do that. It's easy. They then observe the shock waves, which result by monitoring the changes in advertising prices and sales of that and other commodities. The objective of such studies is to acquire a know-how to set the public economy into a predictable state of motion or change, even a controlled self-destructive state of motion, which will convince the public that a certain expert people should take control of the money system and reestablish security rather than liberty and justice for all. When the subject citizens are rendered unable to control their financial affairs, they of course become totally enslaved, a source of cheap labor. That's how they also get a lot of younger people to go in the military. They'll create a price shock in an area, and they start calling it a depressed area. And most of the 18 to 21-year-olds will see the military as a viable solution and join the military. Not only the prices of commodities, but also the availability of labor can be used as a means of shock testing. Labor strikes deliver excellent shocks to an economy, especially in the critical service areas of trucking, transportation, communication, public utilities, energy, water, garbage collection. By shock testing, it is found that there is a direct relationship between the availability of money flowing in the economy and the psychological outlook and response of masses of people dependent on upon that availability. For example, there's a measurable quantitative relationship between the price of gasoline and the probability that a person would experience a headache, feel a need to watch a violent movie, smoke a cigarette, or go to the tavern for a mug of beer. It is most interesting that by observing the measuring of economic modes by which the public tries to run from their problems and escape from reality, and by applying the mathematical theory of operations research, it is possible to program computers to predict the most probable combination of created events which will bring about a complete control and subjugation of the public through a subversive of the public economy by shaking the plum tree. How you like that, folks? Happens to you every day. You just didn't know what was going on. Economic amplifiers are the active components of economic engineering. The basic characteristic of any amplifier, mechanical, electrical, or economic, is that it receives an input control signal and delivers energy from the independent energy source to a specific output terminal in a predictable relationship to that input control signal. The simplest form of economic amplifier is a device called advertising. If a person is spoken to by a TV advertiser, and if he were a 12-year-old, then due to suggestibility, he will, with certain probability, respond or react to that suggestion with the uncritical response of a 12-year-old, and will reach into his economic reservoir and deliver its energy and buy that product on impulse when he passes it in the store. An economic amplifier may have several inputs and outputs. Its response might be instantaneous or delayed. Its circuit symbol might be a rotary switch of its options or exclusive, qualitative go or no go. Or it might have a parametric input-output relationship specific by a matrix with internal energy sources represented. Whatever its form might be, its purpose is to govern the flow of energy from the source to an output sink in direct relationship to an input control signal. For this reason, it is called an active circuit element or component. Economic amplifiers fall into classes called strategies, and in comparison with electronic amplifiers, the specific internal functions of an economic amplifier are called logistical instead of electrical. Therefore, economic amplifiers not only deliver power gain, but also, in effect, are used to cause changes in the economic circuitry. In the design of an economic amplifier, we must have some idea of at least five functions, which are an available input signals, desired output control objectives, the strategic objective, the available economic power sources, the logistical options. The process of defining and evaluating these factors and incorporating the economic amplifier into an economic system has been popularly called game theory. The design of an economic amplifier begins with the specifications of the power level of the output, which can range from personal to national. The second condition is accuracy of response, i.e., how accurately the output action is a function of the input command. How high gain combined with strong feedback helps to deliver the required precision. Most of the error will be in the input data signal. Personal input data tends to be specific, while national input tends to be statistical. Okay, so questions to be answered. Short list of inputs. What, when, where, how, why, and who. So general information, telephone taps, surveillance, analysis of garbage, behavior of children in school. So now you know why they do all that. It's just economics. Why are they dealing with surveillance? Why are they going? Why do they want to put a Google thing in your house? It's just economic control. Standard of living by food, clothing, shelter, and transportation. Social context, telephone, itemized record of calls, family, marriage certificates, birth certificates, friends, associates, memberships in organizations, political affiliation. The personal paper trail, personal buying habits, personal consumer preferences, checking accounts, credit card purchases, tagged credit card purchases, the credit card purchase of products bearing the UPC Universal Product Code. Assets, checking accounts, savings, real estate, business, automobiles, safety deposit at bank, and stock market. Liabilities would be editors, enemies. That should be, I think it's, I don't know if that's that or not. Enemies, loans, consumer credit. Government sources, welfare, social security, USD surplus food, doles, grants, and subsidies. Principle of this ploy, the citizen will almost always make the collection of the information easy if they can operate with the free sandwich principle of eat now and pay later. That's so true. Government sources, Internal Revenue Service, OSHA. That's the offshore trust right there. Now you know what's happened. You've gone from an actual country over to a system of massive control. That's that's what trafficking is. Census, etc. Other government sources, surveillance of U.S. mail. This is a biggie right here. Why is all the mail in the hands of the District of Columbia? Strengths and weaknesses, activities, sports, hobbies. See legal, fear, anger, crime record. Hospital records, drug sensitivities, reaction to pain. Psychiatric records, fears, angers, disgust, adaptability, reactions to stimuli, violence, suggestibility or hypnosis, pain, pleasure, love, and sex. Methods of coping, adaptability, behavior, consumption of alcohol, drugs, entertainment, religious factors influencing behavior, other methods of escaping from reality. Payment modus, pay on time, payment of telephone bills, energy purchases, water purchases, repayment of loans, house payments, automobile payments, payments on credit cards. Political sensitivity, beliefs, contacts, position, products, activities, strengths, and weaknesses. Legal inputs, behavioral control, excuses for investigation, search, arrest, employment, and force to modify behavior. Court records, police records, driving records, report made to police, insurance information, anti-establishment acquaintances. So, national input information, business sources, prices, commodities, and sales. Didn't know they went through all this, huh? Investments in stocks, inventory, production tools, machinery, buildings, and improvements, the stock market. Banks and credit bureaus, credit information, payment information, polls, surveys, publications, telephone records, energy and utility purchases. Outputs, create controlled situations, manipulation of the economy, hence society, controlled by control of compensation and income. Sequence, allocate opportunities, destroy opportunities. Control the economic environment, controls the availability of raw materials. Control capital, control bank rates, control the inflation of currency, control the possession of property, controls industrial capacity, controls manufacturing, controls the availability of goods, controls the prices of commodities, controls services and labor force, controls payments to government officials, controls the legal functions, controls the personal data files, uncorrectable by the party slandered, controls advertising, controls media contact, controls material available for TV and viewing, disengages attention from real issues, engage emotions, creates disorder, chaos, and insanity, controls design for more probing tax forms, controls surveillance, controls the storage of information, develops psychological analysis and profiles of individuals, control legal functions, controls sociological factors, controls health options, preys on weaknesses, cripples strength, and leeches the wealth and substance. The table strategies are do this to get this, keep the public ignorant, less public organization, maintain access to control points for feedback, required reaction to outputs, prices, and sales, create preoccupation, lower defenses, attack the family unit, control of education of the young, give less cash and more credit to endols, more self-indulgence and more data, attack the privacy of the church, destroy faith in this sort of government, social conformity, computer programming simplicity, minimize the tax protests, maximum economic data, minimum enforcement problems, stabilize the consent, simplicity coefficients, tighten control of variables, simpler computer input data, greater predictability, establish boundary conditions, problem simplicity solution of differential and difference equations, proper timing, less data shift and blurring, minimize control, minimum resistance to control, collapse of currency, destroy faith of the American people and each other. Here's the ultimate objective of the New World Order. Experience has proven that the simplest method of securing a silent weapon and gaining control of the public is to keep the public undisciplined and ignorant of basic systems, principles on one hand, while keeping them confused, disorganized, and distracted with matters of no real importance on the other. This is achieved by disengaging their minds, sabotaging their mental activities, providing a low-quality program of public education in mathematics, logic systems, design and economics, and discouraging technical creativity. Engaging their emotions, increasing their self-indulgence, and their indulgence in emotional and physical activities, unrelenting emotional affrontations and attacks, mental and emotional rape by way of constant barrage of sex, violence, and wars in the media, especially the TV and the newspapers. Giving them what they desire in excess, junk food for thought, and depriving them of what they really need, rewriting history and the law of subjecting the public to a deviant creation, thus being able to shift their thinking from personal needs to highly fabricated outside priorities. These preclude their interest in and discovery in silent weapons of social automation technology. The general rule is that their profit is in confusion, and more confusion, the more profit. Therefore, the best approach is to create problems and then offer the solutions. So, media keep the adult public attention diverted away from the real social issues and captivated by matters of no real importance. Schools keep the young public ignorant of real mathematics, real economics, real law, and real history. Entertainment keep the public entertainment below a sixth grade level. Work keep the public busy, busy, busy with no time to think, back on the farm with the other animals. A silent weapon system operates upon data obtained from a docile public by legal, but not always lawful, force. Much information is made available to silent weapon system programmers through the Internal Revenue Service. See studies in the structure of American economy or an IRS source list. Says this information consists of the enforced delivery of well-organized data contained in federal and state tax forms collected, assembled, and submitted by slave labor provided by taxpayers and employers. Y'all starting to see the picture here? Furthermore, the number of such forms submitted to the IRS is a useful indicator of public consent, an important factor in strategic decision making. Other data sources are given the short list of input. Consent coefficients, numerical feedback indicating victory, status, psychological basis. When the government is able to collect tax and seize private property without just compensation, it is an indication that the public is ripe for surrender and is consenting to enslavement and legal encroachment. A good and easily qualified indicator of harvest time is the number of public citizens who pay income tax despite an obvious lack of reciprocal or honest service from the government. The next step in the process of designing an economic amplifier is discovering the energy sources. The energy sources which support any primitive economic system are, of course, a supply of raw materials, the consent of the people to labor and consequently assume a certain rank, position, level, or class in a social structure, i.e., to provide labor in various levels in the pecking order. Each class, in guaranteeing its own level of income, controls the class immediately below it, hence preserves the class structure. This provides stability and security, but also government from the top. As time goes on, and communication and education improve, the lower class elements of the social labor structure become knowledgeable and envious of the good things that the upper class members have. They also begin to attain a knowledge of energy systems and the ability to enforce their rise through the class structure. This threatens the sovereignty of the elite. If this rise of a lower class can be postponed long enough, the elite can achieve energy dominance, and labor by consent no longer will hold a position of an essential economic energy source. Until such energy dominance is absolutely established, the consent of people to labor and let others handle their affairs must be taken into consideration, since failure to do so could cause the people to interfere in the final transfer of energy sources to the control of the elite. It is essential to recognize that at this time, public consent is still an essential key to the release of energy in the process of economic amplification. Therefore, consent is the energy release mechanism will now be considered. The successful application of strategy requires a careful study of inputs, outputs, and strategy connecting the inputs and outputs, and the available energy sources to fuel the strategy. This study is called logistics. A logistical problem is studied at the elementary level first, and then levels of greater complexity are studied at the synthesis of elementary factors. This means that a given system is analyzed, broken down into subsystems, and these in turn are analyzed until, by this process, one arrives at the logistical atom, the individual. Remember, the individual is Internal Revenue Service term. So every time you say if you say I'm an individual, or you claim to be an individual, you are saying that you're a U.S. citizen offshore in a trust in the U.S. Virgin Islands or Puerto Rico or something like that. You're in one of the territories. You're not in the states of the union. So please don't claim that. This is where the process of synthesis properly begins at the time of birth of the individual. From the time a person leaves its mother's womb, and every effort is directed towards building, maintaining, and withdrawing into artificial wombs, various sorts of substitute protective devices or shells. The objective of these artificial wombs is to provide a stable environment for both stable and unstable activity, to provide for a shelter for the evolutionary process of growth and maturity, i.e., survival to provide security for freedom and provide defensive protection for offensive activity. This is equally true of both the general public and the elite. However, there is a definite difference in the way each of these classes go about the solution of problems. The primary reason why individual citizens, that is a trafficked individual there, of a country create a political structure is a subconscious wish or desire to perpetuate their own dependency relationship of childhood. Simply put, they want a human God to eliminate all risk from their life, pat them on the head, kiss their bruises, put a chicken on every dinner table, clothe their bodies, tuck them into bed at night, and tell them that everything will be all right when they wake up in the morning. This public demand is incredible. So the human God, the politician, meets incredibility with incredibility by promising the world and delivering nothing. So who is the bigger liar, the public or the Godfather? The public behavior is surrender born of fear, laziness, and expediency. It is the basis of the welfare state as a strategic weapon useful against a disgusting public. Most people want to be able to subdue and or kill other human beings which disturb their daily lives, but they do not want to have to cope with the moral and religious issues which such an overt act on their part might arise. Therefore, they assign the dirty work to others, including their own children, so as to keep the blood off their own hands. I've seen that I don't know how many times, John. They rave about the humane treatment of animals and then sit down to a delicious hamburger from a whitewashed slaughterhouse down the street and out of sight. But even more hypocritical, they pay taxes to finance a professional association of hitmen, collectively called politicians, and then complain about the corruption in government. It's so true. I'm sorry, that is so true. Again, most people want to be free to do things, to explore, but they are afraid to fail. The fear of failure is manifested in irresponsibility, and especially in delegating those personal responsibilities to others, where success is uncertain or carries possible or created liabilities, law, which the person is not prepared to accept. They want authority, root word author, but they will not accept responsibility or liability, so they hire politicians to face reality for them. So the people hire the politicians so that people can obtain security without managing it, obtain action without thinking about it, inflict theft, injury, and death upon others without having to contemplate either life or death, avoid responsibility for their own intentions, obtain the benefits of reality and science without exerting themselves in the discipline of facing or learning either of these things. They give the politicians the power to create and manage a war machine to provide for survival of the nation womb, prevent encroachment of anything upon the nation womb, destroy the enemy who threatens the nation womb, destroy those citizens of their own country who do not conform for the sake of stability of the nation womb. Politicians hold many quasi-military jobs, the lowest being the police, which are soldiers, the attorneys and the CPAs next to are spies, and saboteurs licensed, and the judges who shout the orders and run the closed union military shop for whatever the market will bear. The generals are industrialists. The presidential level of commander-in-chief is shared by the international bankers. The people know that they have created this farce and financed it with their own taxes, consent, but they would rather knuckle under than be a hypocrite. Thus, a nation becomes divided into two very distinct parts. A docile subnation, great silent majority, and a political subnation. The political subnation remains attached to the docile subnation, tolerates it, and leaches its substance until it grows strong enough to detach itself and then devour its parent. In order to make a meaningful computerized economic decisions about war, the primary economic flywheel, it is necessary to assign concrete logistical values to each element of the war structure, personal and material alike. This process begins with a clear and candid description of subsystems of such a structure, the draft. It says few efforts of human behavior modification are more remarkable than more effective than that of socio-military institution known as the draft. A primary purpose of the draft and other such institutions is to instill by intimidation in the young males of a society the uncritical conviction that the government is omnipotent. The truth is just the opposite, as government exists only with the consent of the people. He is soon taught that the prayer is slow to reverse what the bullet can do in an instant. Thus, a man trained in a religious environment for 18 years of his life can, by this instrument of the government, be broken down, be purged of his fantasies and delusions in a matter of mere months. Once that conviction is instilled, all else becomes easy to instill. Even more interesting is the process by which a young man's parents, who purportedly love him, can be induced to send him off to war to his death. I've never understood that, John, at all. Oh, I love you, son. Now go get killed. Although the scope of this work will not allow this matter to be expanded in full detail, nevertheless, a course overview will be possible and can serve to reveal those factors which must be included in some numerical form in a computer analysis of social and war systems. We begin with a tentative definition of the draft. The draft, selective service, etc., is an institution of compulsory collective sacrifice and slavery, devised by the middle-aged and elderly for the purpose of pressuring the young into doing the public dirty work. It further serves to make the youth as guilty as the elders, thus making criticisms of the elders by the useless likely. That's a generational stabilizer. It is marketed and sold to the public to be labeled patriotic national service. Once a candid economic definition of the draft is achieved, the definition is used to outline the boundaries of a structure called human value system, which in turn is translated into the terms of game theory. The value of such slave labor is given in a table of human values, a table broken down into categories by intellect, experience, post-service jobs, and demand. Some of these categories are ordinary and can be tentatively evaluated in terms of value of certain jobs for which a known fee exists. Some jobs are harder to value because they are unique to the demands of the social subversion. For an extreme example, the value of the mother's instruction to her daughter, causing that daughter to put certain behavioral demands upon a future husband 10 or 15 years hence, thus by suppressing his resistance to the perversion of a government, making it easier for a banking cartel to buy the state of New York in, say, 20 years. Such a problem leans heavily upon the observations and data of wartime espionage and many types of psychological testing. But crude mathematical models, algorithms, can be devised, if not to predict, at least to predetermine these events with maximum certainty. What does not exist by natural cooperation is thus enhanced by calculated compulsion. Human beings are machines, levers which may be grasped in turn, and there is little real difference between automating a society and automating a shoe factory. These derived values are variable. It is necessary to use a current table of human values for computer analysis. These values are given in true measure rather than US dollars, since the latter is unstable, being presently inflated beyond the production of national goods and services so as to give the economy a false kinetic energy, paper and ductility. This is almost over, folks. The silver value is stable. It being possible to buy the same amount with a gram of silver today as could be bought in 1920. Human value measured in silver units changes slightly due to changes in production technology. Enforcement. As in every social system approach, stability is achieved only by understanding the accounting for human nature, action-reaction patterns. A failure to do so can be, and usually is, disastrous. As in other human social schemes, one form or another of intimidation or incentive is essential to the success of the draft. Physical principles of action and reaction must be applied in both internal and external subsystems. To secure the draft, individual brainwashing program in both the family unit and or the peer group must be engaged and brought under control. The man of the household must be housebroken to ensure the junior will grow up with the right social training and attitudes. Now, does everybody understand why it's father no longer knows best? The advertising media, etc., are engaged to see if that the father to be is a pussy whipped before or by time he is married. He is taught that either conforms to the social notch cut out for him, or his sex life will be hobbled, and his tender companion will be zero. He is made to see that the woman demands security more than logical, principled, and honorable behavior. By the time his son must go to war, father, with jelly for the backbone, will slam a gun into Junior's hand before father will risk the censure of his peers or make a hypocrite of himself by crossing the investment he has in his own personal opinion or self esteem. Junior will go to war or father will be embarrassed. So Junior will go to war, the true purpose notwithstanding. Mother, the female element of human society, is ruled by emotion first and logic second. In the battle between logic and imagination, imagination always wins. Fantasy prevails, maternal instincts dominate, so the child comes first and the future comes second. A woman with a newborn baby is too starry eyed to see the wealthy man's cannon fodder or a cheap source of slave labor. A woman must, however, be conditioned to accept the transition to reality when it comes, or sooner. As the transition becomes more difficult to manage, the family unit must be carefully disintegrated. The state-controlled public education and state-operated child care centers must become more common and legally enforced so as to begin the detachment of the child from the mother and father at an earlier age. Inoculation of behavioral drugs, Ritalin, can speed the transition for the child. Mandatory caution: a woman's impulsive anger can override fear. An irate woman's power must never be underestimated, and her power over a pussy whipped husband must likewise never be underestimated. It got women to vote in 1920. The emotional pressure for self-preservation during the time of war and self-serving attitude of the common herd that have an option to avoid the battlefield. If Junior can be persuaded to go, is all of the pressure finally necessary to propel Johnny off to war? Their quiet blackmailings of him are the threats: no sacrifice, no friends, no glory, no girlfriends. What about Junior's sister? She is given all of the good things of life by her father, and taught to expect the same from her future husband, regardless of price. Those who will not use their brains are no better off than those who have no brains. And so, this mindless school of jellyfish, father, mother, son, and daughter, become useful beasts of burden or trainers of the same. And here is notes. I believe that's the end of it. I just wanted to write, yeah, this is the end of it. I'll go ahead and read his notes, and then we can see what he says. Note. So you now know. So now you know. This chapter could only come in the beginning. Your preconceived ideas had to be shattered in order for you to understand the rest of this book. In this chapter, you can see every step that the elite have taken in their war to control this once great nation. You can see the steps that will be taken in the future. You can no longer pretend innocence. Your denial of the conspiracy will fall on deaf ears. This book is a part of the education that will give Americans the weapons needed in the coming months and years of hardship as the New World Order struggles to be born. Many will argue that silent weapons for quiet wars is only a bogus conglomeration of words for which the writer was never taking credit or responsibility. Those who do so ignore the self-evident truths contained within the document. They ignore these truths because they are an indictment of their own ignorance, which they cannot face. The document was first found in 1969, correctly outlines events, which, I'm sorry, yeah, subsequently came to pass. It cannot be ignored or dismissed. The document is genuine. Its truths cannot be negated or shrugged away. The message is this: you must accept that you have been cattle, an ultimate consequence of being cattle, which is slavery, or you must prepare to fight, and if necessary, to die to preserve God given right to freedom. That last sentence is a real reason why people chose to ignore silent weapons for quiet wars. People are not ready to admit they have been cattle. They're not prepared to fight, and if necessary, to die for freedom. It is an indictment of the citizens of the United States of America, and that this total confirmation of the truth of the information contained in silent weapons for quiet wars. So I wanted to read that for everyone. I might go on to this other chapter two, secret societies in the New World Order, and in later broadcast. So thank you for listening to the 61st broadcast of the t-roh Show. If you like the content, leave a like or subscribe, and we will see you next week.